أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers, sisters, and friends. I want to begin by thanking Sheffield University, ISOC, for inviting me today to deliver this lecture on the plight of the Uyghur Muslims. I want to begin by asking you all a few frank questions, and I want to see some honest responses. Hands up. Who here has heard of the plight of the Syrians, or what's happening in Syria? Can I see a show of hands? Keep your hands up if you've heard of the plight of the situation of the Palestinians. Keep your hands up if you've heard the plight of the situation of the Rohingya Muslims. Keep your hands up if you've heard of the plight of the Muslims of Kashmir. The vast majority. Same. But if I was to ask you all, well and truly, were you aware of the situation of the Uyghur Muslims in China? Can I see a show of hands? Okay, that's an impressive number, not as much as before, but alhamdulillah. The reason why I believe that not many Muslims are aware of the situation of the Uyghur Muslims, as well as other Turkic Muslims in China, is because there are large diaspora communities in the West. So we know what's happening in Kashmir because there are many Bangladeshis and Pakistanis and Indians in the West. Same with Myanmar and the Rohingya situation. The reason why we know or are aware so much of the situation in Syria and Palestine, first and foremost, is because there's huge Arab diasporas in the West, as well as the fact that there is constant news coverage of the situation. But if I was to be absolutely honest, I wasn't even aware that there was 22 million Turkic Muslims in China until only a couple of years ago. I really was not aware. Another reason why I believe that not many Muslims, and even non-Muslims generally, are unaware of the situation is because the Chinese government has done a fantastic job in keeping a lid on the systematic oppression of the Uyghurs. Before I proceed with today's lecture, I want to clarify something on terminology. Now, the region in which the vast majority of the Uyghurs reside in, it is called East Turkestan, or occupied East Turkestan. The Chinese name for this region is called Xinjiang, which means new frontier. For the sake of solidarity with our Uyghur brothers and sisters, I will not be referring to this land as Xinjiang. I'll be referring to it as occupied East Turkestan, or East Turkestan. Another reason why I believe that we are generally aware of certain oppressions that are taking place in the Muslim majority world is because we know the history of those regions or those people. So whilst the crux of today's lecture will be the plight of the Uyghurs, I would like to just briefly touch upon the historical background of the Uyghurs. So who are the Uyghurs? The Uyghurs are ethnic Turks. And when I mean by ethnic Turks, I don't mean those who are currently in modern day Turkey, I mean of the Turkic people. So they come from the same ethnic lineage as the Uzbeks, as the Kyrgyz, as the Kazakhs, as the Tajiks, as the Turkmens, and generally those countries which make up Central Asia today. And for those of you who may or may not be watching Dilly Hussain, the famous Turkish show, you'll hear a name called Uyghur Khan mentioned a few times in the show. That's because Uyghur Khan is considered the founding father of the Turkic people. And the Uyghurs were one of many tribes who were born or date their lineage back to Uyghur Khan. And they were part of a very large Turkic nomadic confederation located in Central Asia. And for whatever reasons, they all, due to the nature of the nomadic lifestyle, they migrated to different parts of the world. So the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs went towards eastwards towards China, whereas the Seljuks or the Kayis and the Ghaznavids and others, they went towards the west, towards the Middle East and Anatolia. And as I mentioned already, East Turkestan is the term that we'll be using in today's lecture. But what Turkestan basically means is the classical Persian term that means the land of the Turks. With regards to the religion of the Uyghurs, before they accepted Islam, it was shamanism, or Tengism specifically. And Tengism is the religion whereby you worship and revere nature, the weather, the moon, the sun, as well as worshipping your predecessors. And a few numbers, not a great number, of Uyghurs accepted Buddhism in the 8th and 9th century, but nothing of significant amount. Here we have a map of what was once the great Mongol Empire. After about 60 to 70 years after the death of Genghis Khan, there was a huge power struggle between his sons. And the great Mongol Empire has split into 4 khaganates or khanates. So here we have the Great Khanate, which is the majority of China. You have the Chagatai Khanate, the Il Khanate, and the Golden Horde. In the space of about 70, 80 years, these 3 accepted Islam. Islamic scholars and historians question the sincerity of the Il Khanate. They say there was a nominal acceptance of Islam for political objectives. But the Chagatai Khanate, which covers most of Central Asia and parts of India, they were the last of the Mongol Khanates to accept Islam. And that was around 1225. And it was only in 934 where it was recorded that we started seeing large tribes of Uyghurs accepting Islam. But that was under the Kharakhanid Khanate. And the Kharakhanid Khanate was not Mongol, it was an Uyghur Khanate. And there was one sultan called Bogrul Khan. And when he accepted Islam, there were some recorded numbers of Uyghurs accepting Islam. Again, it was nothing major or widespread. But we started seeing the acceptance of Islam by the Uyghurs under the Chagatai Khanate. And when this Khanate here split into 2, the west and the east, the eastern Chagatai Khanate was named Mogolistan. Now for those of you who are from the Indian subcontinent would be aware of who the Mughals were. And the Mughals also date their lineage back to the Mongols or Mogolistan. And it was on the Mogolistan that the Uyghurs, in large numbers, the vast majority had accepted Islam. When looking at Uyghur history, whether it be Uyghur historians or even Western secular historians, there's a general consensus that it's broken up to 7 sections. So you have the pre-imperial period, the Uyghur Khaganate period, the Uyghur Kingdom period, that falls within the 3rd bit. That's when we start seeing the first records of Uyghurs accepting Islam. Then you have the Mongol expansion, 1210 to 1760, and within as a sub period, the Mogolistan period. You had the Manchu occupation, 1760 to 1910, the Republican era, 1911 to 1949, and the Communist era of China from 1949 to the current day. Now, for the relevance of today's lecture, we are only going to focus on the last 3 bits of history, because it is absolutely important for us to understand how the Uyghurs got to the situation that they are currently in today. And for us to understand that, we need to assess these 3 parts of Uyghur history. Manchu Empire. The Manchu Empire was run by the Qing Dynasty. They were the last imperial Chinese dynasty, and they started making military advances into Mogolistan from 1759 onwards. So by this time, the Mogolistan was in decline. It was at the brink of survival. It was practically finished. And the Manchu Empire had dominated the entirety of Mogolistan by 1864, and that included East Turkestan. However, in 1864, there was a successful revolt against the Manchu garrisons in East Turkestan, and they managed to repel the Manchu soldiers an occupation, and they established a state called the Yetishar Kingdom, which survived for around 12 years. In 1876, the Manchu Empire renewed its efforts to regain control over East Turkestan, and in 1884, on the 18th of November, the Manchu Empire defeated the Uyghur Yetishar Kingdom and renamed East Turkestan as Xinjiang, which basically means new frontier. And the reason why this period of history is so important, again, there is a near consensus that the initiating point of the systematic oppression of Uyghurs began under the Manchu Empire. Religious persecution, racial persecution, socioeconomic marginalization, the fact that farming lands were taken away from Uyghur peasants, the fact that they were given the worst jobs, they were pushed to the outskirts of the lands where there was no vegetation, and things like this. That kind of persecution first began in the Manchu Empire, and some have argued that what we see today or hear today is a mere extension and advancement of what began under the Manchu Empire. In 1911, there was a nationalist revolution in China, and they overthrew the Manchu Empire, and then East Turkestan came under the control of Chinese nationalist warlords. However, 1920 was also the year or the period of the birth of Uyghur nationalism. And this was inevitable because nationalism during that period, especially after World War I, was the predominant ideology for political self-determination throughout the entire world. Countries that had been previously colonized now were seeking their own independent states or nation states. So it was natural that the Uyghur people were going to adopt the prevalent ideology towards statehood at the time, and that was nationalism. And in 1921, Soviet leaders, they met with Turkic leaders in Tashkent. So the Soviets, they met with the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, the Turkmens, the Kazakhs, the Uyghurs, and basically they said, look, we will support you to establish your own state, not material, we will give you money, and we will give you the support that's required. And in reality, what that was that the Soviets were merely trying to create a buffer zone between themselves and China, as well as creating vessel states to advance their own hegemonic and geopolitical interests. So with the support of the Soviets, we saw the birth of the first republic, East Turkestan Islamic Republic of 1933. Here are the ministers of that first republic. This was the Prime Minister of the First Republic. However, this state barely lasted a year, and they were defeated by the Chinese nationalists in the Battle of Kashgar in the space of 12 months. But again, there were some renewed efforts by Uyghur nationalists, and they managed to successfully establish a second republic, again supported by the Soviets, in 1944. But in 1949, they were defeated by the communists, and the communists had renamed East Turkestan as the autonomous Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China. We'll see later on in this lecture how it is anything but autonomous. The communist era. What was the situation like for the Uyghurs in China under the communist era? I want to also just make a brief clarification. The Uyghur Muslims make up the vast majority of the Turkic Muslims in China. However, there are other Turkic Muslims who are also suffering the same persecution, namely the Kazakhs and the Qings. But because they make up the vast majority, we will stick with the term of the Uyghurs. In front of you, you all have handouts of a timeline. And there you will see many dates, many events, many recorded events of whereby student protests led by academics and Uyghur faith leaders were violently quelled. There were small pockets of Uyghur resistance. And as we have seen throughout history, that whenever there is systematic oppression, you will see some groups within the oppressed minorities resort to violence as a form of resistance. This is not something that we should be amazed by. It's a common occurrence. But the resistance was small in number and not necessarily effective. However, the protests were, and you'd be surprised that the vast majority of the protests were led by students, by female students, by scholars, by academics, by doctors, and they were violently quelled. And that resulted in mass incarceration, extrajudicial killings, imprisonment of people who were non-violently trying to attain their basic rights and freedoms and equal treatment as other Chinese citizens. And I guess the environment was not that different to what the situation was in the Balkans or Eastern Europe. But the communist era of East Turkestan was uniquely different because East Turkestan was regarded as a region which posed a threat, an existential threat to the Chinese state. and the unity of the Chinese state. And the racial persecution, the political repression, the religious censorship, and the socio-economic marginalization that were first started under the Manchus continued, increased under the communist era. There are too many examples to cite, hence why I asked the ISOC to print out a timeline. There are examples of many prominent Uyghur leaders who were assassinated, who were imprisoned, who were killed, scholars, students, academics. There's far too many to cite. The situation of Uyghur Muslims today. Before I go into this slide, I have a message for you all from Saleh Hudayr. Saleh Hudayr is a prominent Uyghur activist based in the United States. He's part of the World Uyghur Congress. Sadly, he also has family members currently in these re-education concentration camps, and he has this message for you all today.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. I would like to thank Sheffield University for hosting this event on the plight of the Uyghur Muslims in occupied East Turkestan. As we speak, millions of Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in East Turkestan are currently incarcerated in so-called political and cultural re-education centers or vocational training centers, which are actually concentration camps. And more recently, videos have emerged which show that these are actually more like prisons in which the people are tortured, they're forcefully starved, medical experiments are conducted on them. It's in a way like a modern 21st century Holocaust. The situation in East Turkestan is not exactly new. I mean, the situation has definitely gotten worse over the 69 years of Chinese occupation and colonization. But the history of this goes back since 1949 when the Chinese communists invaded. The root of the conflict is the name, is in the name itself. The Chinese call East Turkestan Xinjiang, which means new territory. It's an occupied territory, and this has led the Chinese regime to try to eradicate, to come up with a final solution to the Muslim problem in East Turkestan, and that's to eventually eradicate, if not assimilate, the entire Turkic Muslim population.
The situation of Uyghur Muslims today. Now, since the communist takeover in 1949, we started seeing a mass migration of ethnic Han Chinese to East Turkestan. And then, as a result of that, we started seeing millions of Uyghur Muslims then shipped, literally shipped out of East Turkestan to other parts of China as part of a redevelopment strategy. Essentially, they were used for cheap and slave labor. Young Uyghur men and women were taken from East Turkestan and they were shipped to other parts of China to work for little to nothing. And the Han Chinese who then migrated to East Turkestan, they attained the best government jobs, the best jobs in the private sector. The Han farmers were given lands belonging to the Uyghurs. They had the best access to education, and there was clear discrimination based on both racial and religious lines. And there were also other issues happening as well. When Uyghur men and women were falling unwell, they used to go to the doctors and they were given either sterilization pills or they were given birth control pills as medicine. And the region of East Turkestan was also used for nuclear weapons testing. Masajids and Uyghur architecture was destroyed. All part of redevelopment strategies and fanciful names for the advancement of the Chinese state, but that's what essentially was happening. The war on terror, brothers and sisters and friends, changed everything. Because prior to 2011 and 9/11, the predominant narrative within China was that the Uyghurs were separatists. Of course, there were references and persecution along religious lines, but the propaganda or the narrative was that the Uyghurs were nationalists who wanted to break away from China and they wanted to establish their own state. And this, again, poses a threat to the unity of China. But the war on terror changed everything. Why? Because China adopted the war on terror narrative that there was now an ideological issue with Islam. Like many Western governments, like the US, like Russia, like Britain and France, the issue no longer was, just like in the 60s and 70s, for those of you who know Middle Eastern history, it was all about Arab socialism. Gamal Abdel Nasser and these guys who posed a threat to the West. That changed after the 90s, mid-90s. It all became a threat of Islamism. And in reality, what this meant was that there were fundamental aspects, normative concepts of Islam, which the Chinese government, like their respective governments all around the world, were threatened by. And now this was used to set up re-education camps. Now re-education camps sounds like, something that could be of some kind of benefit, but it's not. These are modern day concentration camps. Here's a picture of Uyghur men in one of the re-education camps. If I had not told you, you would have thought that these men were awaiting death. There's over 150 re-education camps all around East Turkestan. The United Nations and Amnesty International have cited at least 1 million Uyghurs are now in these re-education camps. And what happens in these re-education camps? Let me tell you what happens in these re-education camps. There's a systematic indoctrination of Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims to renounce their faith and to adopt Maoist ideology. They are prevented from praying their salah. When they wake up in the morning, they have to sing communist and Maoist anthems. Before they go to sleep, they have to sing the same anthems. They have to partake in flag-raising ceremonies. Husband and wives are forced to dance with other people's husbands and wives. They are forced to drink alcohol, consume pork. Those who have passed away in the concentration camps, their organs have been taken without the permission of their families. Some of the bodies have not even been returned to the families, they've been cremated. These are just some of the things that are taking place at these re-education camps. And the videos and the testimonies, there are many. If you just go online, you go to Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, or go to the news website that I run, 5 Pillars, there is a plethora of videos to show that these things are happening. If that's the assimilation that's taking place inside these re-education camps, what's going on outside of the camps? What's going on in everyday society in East Turkestan? Men are not allowed to have beards. Only particular age groups of men can have beards of a particular length. Men are not allowed to wear trousers above their ankles. Uyghur Muslim women are not allowed to wear their hijab if they work in the public sector or any public places, or even if they not even work, even if they enter these places, hospitals, universities, government buildings. Uyghur butchers have to carry out their work in cages because they're not trusted with bladed objects outside of this cage. Just last year, there was a new law that came through that possessing a copy of the Quran was punishable by the law. If you were caught with a copy of the Quran, you would be fined. If you were caught re-offending, you would be imprisoned. Keep in mind, these are not £5–10 fines. These are very hefty fines, which, with regards to the socio-economic situation of the vast majority of Uyghurs, it's just not affordable. That's the kind of situation right now in 2018 the Uyghurs are experiencing, brothers and sisters. I can stand here and regurgitate and relay facts, dates, names, events, incidents, and this lecture could be all about data. But I don't believe that's the true objective of any lecture or any kind of public event. We have to extract lessons from the experience of the Uyghurs, just like we take lessons from the Quran, from the Seerah, from Islamic history, from the plight of other Muslims. Just like those of you who are either from the Indian subcontinent or the Arab world or Africa, and you hear the stories of our grandparents, there's always lessons to take from them. And the situation of the Uyghurs are no different. So there's 3 lessons that I'd like you all to take. Lessons in terms of reflection, lessons in terms of drawing some forms of similarities and likeness, not in the levels of persecution, but the narrative and the environment. First and foremost, and this is quite clear, the failure of communism. The failure of communism as a global ideology and worldview to accommodate its citizens of different faiths and no faith. That there is a long history of religious persecution, not just of Islam, but of other religions as well, but especially Islam. For those of you who know Khabib Nurmagomedov, the UFC lightweight champion, he's from a place called Dagestan. If you read about the history of wrestling and sambo in that region, in the Caucasus, it wasn't just an issue of wrestling. No. Wrestling was a form of passive resistance and a mechanism for them to meet as a community, to wrestle and to maintain the bond of Islamic brotherhood. This was from the words of Khabib himself and his grandfather. They said this. So, if that's what people had to resort to maintain and preserve their religion and their bonds of brotherhood, it's abundantly clear that communism as a worldview has failed in that regard. Secondly, institutional Islamophobia. A couple of days ago, I posted an article about some findings by the Human Rights Watch, and then it was corroborated by an article on the Chinese Communist newspaper, that 1 million Han Chinese citizens were sent to East Turkestan and were made to reside with Uyghur families for 7 to 30 days. What was their job? Just think about this for a moment. You're in your homes. Some people have been sent to your homes by the government to report back on how Islamic you are, or what unpatriotic beliefs you may hold. When I posted this article on Facebook, a few people commented and said, Brother Dilly, you're drawing similarities with the situation of Muslims in the West. It's just incomparable. Absolutely, it is incomparable. The levels of persecution is incomparable. But the similarity I was trying to draw was the ideological premise which justifies these laws. The same ideological Islamophobia, for those of you who attended my lecture last year, last year I gave a lecture on what is Islamophobia. And I spoke about everyday Islamophobia, the pulling of the scarves, the graffiti of the masajid, the beating up of old men and women. That's everyday Islamophobia. But what we don't focus on is on the institutional level of Islamophobia, how government institutions discriminate towards Islam and Muslims. That ideology is the same. It's the same. Because they perceive certain aspects of Islam which by consensus is normative as a threat. And what concepts am I talking about? I'm talking about the concept of ummah. The fact that there is a bond of brotherhood and sisterhood with others of different ethnicities and races. The concept of jihad. Big problem. Because it means resistance. It means resisting occupation. It means resisting injustice. The concept of enjoining good and forbidding evil. The concept of trying to aspire to have some form of polity which reflects the religious needs and values of the Muslims. And these are just some of the concepts which are existential threats. And you just need to look at the reports by Henry Jackson Society, as well as other right-wing influential think tanks that advise the government that, yeah, these concepts, they're problematic. Because in the day and age of the nation state, these things pose a threat. And the Chinese government used the same rhetoric. They use the same rhetoric. The Uyghurs, they want to establish a regressive, backward, barbaric, medieval Sharia state, and therefore we can't allow this to happen. It's the same narrative. It's the same narrative which the Myanmar government uses. It's the same narrative which Bashar al-Assad has used. It's the same, we've seen it over and over again in the last 10, 15 years, especially the dawn of the war on terror. So what we can draw is that the ideology which has allowed re-education camps, the banning of the Quran, the forced consumption of alcohol and pork, is the same ideology which has allowed in the UK the Channel de-radicalization program. Young Muslim girls, as young as 4 and 5, being questioned without their parents present about why they wear the hijab. Why Muslims are seen as disloyal and unappreciative because they may not want to wear a red poppy or may opt to wear a white poppy. That if you happen to be Caucasian, white, English, and you criticize the foreign policy of this government, it's fine. It's seen as a breath of fresh air. But if a Muslim does it, or a person of color does it, all of a sudden it's, how dare you do this? So, not similar in the sense of the levels of persecution, but absolutely exactly the same from an ideological premise. The same fear of Islam justifies the different laws and policies that we are seeing in East Turkestan and in the West. And last and foremost, the assimilation agenda. You know, I was speaking to some Uyghur colleagues not too long ago, and they were saying that elderly parents and grandparents were putting themselves forward to attend these re-education camps. I forgot in a previous slide, this is an official Chinese document issued to a farmer, Uyghur farmer, stating that they have to come and attend these re-education camps. That's stamped by the official Chinese government. And I heard from my colleagues that the elderly are saying, we will go to these camps because we've lived a long life. Our children, our grandchildren, they're still young. You know, we'll opt out, we'll opt to go to these camps just so they could preserve the deen and the Turkic culture of the Uyghurs. They are opting themselves to go. And they're resisting assimilation. Because in Islam, for those of you who know a bit about the decline of Islam in Spain, the situation was so bad in Muslim Spain that scholars at the time were making it halal for them to lie about their faith to preserve their own life. And it was a form of resistance, to the point where the ulama of Andalus said that it is halal for you, whilst the Catalonians and the Spanish were forcing you to become Christians, pray Salah with your eyes. We've heard the same thing happening. That was 700 years ago. The same thing's happening now in 2018 at the re-education camps. The Uyghur Muslims and other Turkic Muslims, wallahi, they are resisting. They are resisting to give up their deen. They are resisting to give up their Turkic culture. They're resisting. In the same way, whatever hardships that we face as Muslims, as students, as the shabab of this ummah, we too have to resist these attacks and these changes. In a manner in which is conducive, in a manner in which is from the sunnah, in a manner in which we can articulate why we are not willing to give up fundamentals of our faith. And that we can be equal citizens to any country, contributing in khair, but not giving up our deen. If the Uyghurs are doing this, wallahi we can do this. To conclude, I don't want to end today's lecture on doom and gloom and negatives. I want you all to leave today with some practical action points that every single one of us can engage in. This event itself is one of the things that we should be doing, raising awareness. Continue to organize events, cross-panel discussions, conferences, to raise the awareness about the plight of the Uyghurs. Raising awareness is like stage one of any action points that we can do for any oppressed groups of people. Number two, network with Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. Find out, do you have any Uyghurs or Kazakhs in Sheffield University or in Hallam? Are there any in Sheffield? Are there any in South Yorkshire? Reach out to them, network with them. Let them know that we have heard and we've been informed of the situation of your people who are also our people, and we want to help, we want to assist, and remind them that their blood and their life is no different to that of a Palestinian, a Turk, a Pakistani, a Somalian or a Nigerian. It's the same blood. Let them know that. And naturally, we should engage in campaigns. Whether it be petitions, whether it be attending demonstrations and protests, wherever it may be within the framework of Islam, we should engage in these campaigns to raise awareness and to try to get justice for our brothers and sisters in Turkestan. But the most important thing we can do, based on the very famous hadith of our beloved Prophet ﷺ, when he was asked by one of the companions, Ya Rasulullah, what is the best form of jihad? And he ﷺ responded, Kalimatul Haq, a word of truth to a tyrannical ruler. I think that hadith absolutely applies to accounting the Chinese government. To write letters to the consulate, to write letters to the embassies, to attend conferences and events where we know that Chinese politicians will be attending, to account them. But I do not know any time in history whereby an oppressive regime or an oppressive government or an oppressive state has willingly stopped oppressing minorities without one of the two things or both, without internal resistance or external intervention. I'm willing to be corrected on this. If someone could give me an example from human history whereby a state or a government have thought, okay, woke up one day and thought, you know what, that's enough pressure from the world, I'm just going to start oppressing these people. It's never happened. So therefore, the next level of accountability has to be to the Muslim governments which surround East Turkestan. And there are 5. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, I forgot the other Istan, and Pakistan. Now from the 5 countries, Pakistan, hands down, is militarily the strongest. And at the moment, for those of you, can I see a show of hands of who's of Pakistani origin here? You might be aware that at the moment Pakistan has very strong relations with China, investment of millions, if not billions of dollars in infrastructure and development. You know, things are cozy and good at the moment, especially as the relationship with the US, Pakistan's relation with the US is deteriorating. They are strengthening their ties with China. I want to ask those who put their hands up, can someone tell me on what ideological foundation was Pakistan founded on? Islam. Pakistan was a state which claims and still claims very proudly that it was a land for the Pak, where Muslims could practice their religion without fear freely. Yet in the border of Kalgar, there are Uyghur Muslims who are being arrested and detained for having a copy of the Mus'haf. Brothers and sisters and friends, you and I in this room, we do not have armies, we do not have tanks, we do not have diplomatic power to expel ambassadors, we do not have the power, the influence to apply state-to-state pressure. We don't have none of these things. If we did, it may be a different situation, but we don't. So therefore, we will apply what we can do within our own capacity, utilizing social media, writing blogs, organizing events, writing petitions, attending demonstrations, accounting what's within our remit, within our physical ability. But the state-to-state level accountability is something which lies with governments. And this doesn't just apply to the situation of the Uyghurs in East Turkestan. The same could be said about the Palestinians, the Syrians, the Kashmiris, the Rohingya, the Central African Republic Muslims of Somalia, and others. When such levels of oppression is taking place, where is the element of brotherhood? Where is the element of wala and bara? And the truth be told is that the existing world order, don't worry, I'm not going to descend into conspiracy theories, relax. The era of nation states, which is very new by the way, the vast majority of the countries in this world, and there's 195 of them, the vast majority are not even 100 years old. So it's a new phenomenon. And we have, international bodies like the United Nations, and NATO. And then we have continental organizations, the EU, or the Organization of Islamic Conference, or the Arab League, and so forth. And these international bodies, what it does is that it restricts what a respective country can do to another, whether politically or militarily, unless of course you are China, Russia, France, Britain, or America, right? So brothers and sisters, here are some action points. Carry on organizing events, carry on raising awareness, use your social media accounts for khair, write to the Chinese embassy and consulate, account the respective governments in a manner in which is halal and in a manner in which is conducive. And we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to uplift the oppression of our brothers and sisters in East Turkestan, and He uplift the oppression of all the Muslims and all the oppressed groups of people in this world. Ameen.
With Dilly Hussain. Now it's interesting parts. Guys, have any questions? Stop throwing.
There is one. Go ahead.
Yes.
Good evening. I have a question.
Yes.
You're speaking of East Turkestan as it's like a state, and like international law, we see that the state is made like of sovereignty and recognition by other countries. So I'm thinking, when you say, for example, migration is going from one country to another country, so obviously we cannot speak of migration.
I meant region to region.
Yeah, but it's not really a migration. It's a regional migration, you can say so, but not a migration. And I have a question. My question is, are you fighting for independence, like as a country, or recognition, like international recognition, or for freedom of religion?
Thank you very much. That's a very important two questions she raised. Number one was that I referred to migration or recognition when international bodies and the international community do not recognize East Turkestan as a state. Just because the international body or community doesn't recognize doesn't mean I don't recognize it as a Muslim. I recognize it. In the same way that the international body doesn't recognize North Cyprus, just like it doesn't recognize Palestine, just like it doesn't recognize many states for whatever political driven reasons. I recognize East Turkestan as a Muslim because it was a region, it was a land, it was a state that once existed for much longer than China has existed in its current form. As for the issue of migration, it would apply. If we now started seeing loads of people from Sheffield being shipped to London, and Londoners with their accent being moved up to the north, and all the people from Sheffield were given fantastic jobs because they all happen to be of a particular demographic, even though it's happening domestically in one state, the issue of politicized migration will still apply. And it's happened, case in point, Palestine and the entity of Israel being one example, as well as many others. So migration here I meant domestically from region to region, not state to state. With regards to what I personally am calling for, I am calling for three things with regards to the Uyghurs and the other Turkic Muslims who are being persecuted. For them to be treated as equal citizens like any other Chinese citizens. And there are over 95 or 98 different ethnicities in China. Yet it is the Turkics, the Uyghurs, the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz, not even the Han Chinese who are known as the Hui Muslims. There are another group of Muslims in China called the Huis. They're ethnic Han. They don't get this. Different reasons as to why culturally there are similarities and they've kind of assimilated to mainstream Chinese society, but they don't get that treatment. We want equal treatment for the Uyghurs, for them to be able to practice their religion freely. Number two, that if there is a genuine aspiration to establish a state, an autonomous state separate from that of China, based on one which is reflective of their faith and their values, this should be allowed.
But there is a movement.
But has the movement been quelled? The leaders have been imprisoned, they have been killed,
But
they've
there
been
is
exiled.
today a movement.
Absolutely there is a movement. That's why they're in exile in Turkey and exiled in America. There's not really much they can do from there. And number three, if the establishment of this state is quelled by China, which it has been for decades, then to allow other Muslim majority countries to intervene as mediators to come to some kind of agreement, which hasn't happened at the moment. The only two countries that seem to be talking about this issue is Turkey, which hosts many Uyghurs that are in exile, and America, who have now taken up this Uyghur cause for their own political reasons against China. So those are the three things: equal treatment, a state, if not the external mediation.
Can I just add, you brought up the example of migration. I mean, we don't really have to look far, we just have to look at Tibet. I mean, it's a perfect example of what East Turkestan is actually experiencing at the moment. Because the current governor of East Turkestan, they initiated the concentration camps, was the one who quelled Tibet.
Absolutely.
And he's the one who actually took that theory and took the actual concept and implemented it onto East Turkestan. And if you see Tibet as an occupied territory, or an occupied country that was once independent, why not see East Turkestan as such? Because they're both designated as autonomous regions. They're both autonomous regions within People's Republic of China. And if I'm not mistaken, it was the founding constitution of Chinese Republic that stated that those autonomous regions have the right to cede, to claim independence.
In 1949.
In 1949, had the majority of the population wished it, but obviously, as we all know, the theory doesn't apply in practice.
So as the gentleman rightly stated, in the founding constitution of the Chinese state in 1949, it actually says that those regions that are considered autonomous, if there was widespread will to succeed from China, they would be allowed to do so. Hence, when I cited it in my lecture, I said that it was anything but autonomous. Thank you for adding that.
I would just like to mention what you said about Pakistan, the ties strong with China. To me, the problem in China specifically is not really about Islam, it's just about not accepting different cultures to have all the rights to. Because I know we're here with the Islamic circle, but what concerns me about China is actually a lot beyond Islam. It's exactly Tibet, as was mentioned, that has nothing to do with Islam. They're having exactly the same repercussions that they suffer. Whereas there are other Muslims like the Hui and Xinjiang and this region that they will not go through all that, even though their faith is different. Why? Because they can't be seen as separatists. Because there is this concept in China which I personally don't agree with, because these two regions, as Tibet and East Turkestan or Xinjiang, or call it however you want, they have just been seen as separatists and just they're threatening the unity of China, a unity which is based on an empirical regime carried throughout in the nationalist state, which doesn't make sense to me. But in the case of Pakistan, it seems as a cultural value of another country which is respected. That's the really ironic thing. But when it comes to our people, it's actually depicted as a cultural value that is trying to erode the unity, which that is the main problem. And well, it is terrible. I've actually met many Uyghur Muslims that it's funny how they can be a lot more free outside their region. And they can actually practice their faith outside the region, and many people will tell you that, many Chinese people will tell you that everything is fine in China, but I personally have met many Han people that live in Xinjiang that will tell you that even we're facing problems here because the region is really heated. It's really a problem that is seen only in some regions, and they don't really highlight it because the rest of China has quite much more freedom than we do. Unfortunately.
Thank you for that comment. And there's certainly truth in what you have said. However, what makes it problematic and impossible for me to accept that this systematic oppression isn't ideologically against the Islamic identity of the Uyghurs is the policies of stuff like possessing copies of the Quran, consuming pork and alcohol in these re-education camps, right? There are other Muslims in China, the Uyghur Muslims and others, but the Uyghurs ethnically and culturally have a lot of similarity to the Chinese. And whilst I'm not going to apply a sweeping generalization, there is an assumption. There is an assumption that the Uyghur Muslims are not as conservative as are not as conservative as the Uyghurs. There is a perception. How true this is, Allah knows best. But to say that the current ongoing systematic oppression of the Uyghurs has nothing to do with Islam, it's very difficult to accept that. Simply based on the existing policies that are currently in place. The very activities that are taking place in these re-education camps, which is directly targeting the Islamic identity and the Turkic culture of the Uyghurs, it's undeniable to say that this has nothing to do with a version of Islam which the Chinese government perceives as an existential threat or a threat.
Can I just clarify that I didn't really have to say anything that there's no Islamophobia at all. I just said that it comes under a spectrum of further discrimination, and it's just one part of it.
Absolutely, thank you.
Can I just say, I think it's a synthesis of both in a way. Because what it is essentially, because Uyghurs and all the Turkic Muslims in East Turkestan are Muslim, that forms part of their identity. And the war against their identity, and it could be characterized more of as an ethnic cleansing, if you will. And that ethnicity itself falls under the Islamic beliefs as well.
Yes.
So in order to eradicate Uyghurs and all the Turkic people of the East Turkestan, the Chinese government needs to eradicate their core beliefs. And if they eradicate the core beliefs, that would make it a lot easier for them to be assimilated to the general Han culture. So I think it's more of a synthesis of a fight against an actual culture and Islam itself. In East Turkestan.
Would you agree that a lot of the Uyghur or Turkic culture is Islamic?
Of course.
And there you go.
They're intertwined basically. It's one. It's one in two.
Because the very values and the cultural practices, the vast majority of it is Islamic and has its roots in Islam. So therefore, to get rid of that would make it easier to assimilate a vast group of people, to make it easier for them to carry on what they're doing.
Just in relation to this discussion and about whether religion is targeted by the state, I don't know if many people know about the Falun Gong movement. This is a religious movement in China that's also being persecuted, and there it's made of Han-Chinese. So, clearly the Communist Party in China sees anything that operates outside of it as a threat. And the fact that maybe the Chinese Muslims that are not suffering, are outside of the Uyghur region or East Turkestan, are not suffering as much, is probably just a piecemeal approach of the Communist Party. You don't, when you start a repressive strategy, you don't start it all at once. It's piecemeal, So we have to also be aware that if they're successful, they will go after the Hui Chinese and other groups as well.
Yeah, definitely. Two things to add to that point. With regards to the Uyghur Muslims, there doesn't seem to be an aspiration of establishing a separate state away from China. So of course they don't pose that threat. And of course, in my lecture, I mentioned that before 9/11 and the war on terror, the predominant narrative was that the Uyghurs were actually separatists. That this is what it was. These guys wanted to break away from China, weaken the unity of the Chinese state. But after 9/11, they adopted the narrative, the anti-Islam or the Islamophobic narrative, that it is in fact the faith mixed with the culture, but mainly the faith which poses a threat. And here's where it is. Here's why they are different. And there's no shadow of a doubt there are other oppressed groups of people in China. Without a shadow of a doubt. Some are ethnic Han. But there is no concentration camps for any other group of people except for the Uyghurs and the other Turkic people.
Yeah, I'd like to actually confirm what you said as well. We can't necessarily say that yes, the Chinese Communist government sees anything opposing anything different to it as a threat within People's Republic of China, but the policies that are being implemented in East Turkestan, they're quite unique. None of these sorts of policies have been implemented in other regions. Even Tibet itself, where those policies were copied from, had different policies implemented on them, whereas the oppression that has been implemented on the Uyghurs and other Turkic people in Turkestan It's quite unique in
It's
terms
unique
of,
in the whole of the world.
yes.
It's unique in the. There is not a. There is massacres, there's wars, there's occupation, but what's happening in East Turkestan, there's nothing like this anywhere else in the world. No other groups of people are experiencing what they're experiencing in that systematic fashion that they are. I saw a hand raised from that part of the room. It's gone down again. It's fine. Just
I'm just wondering how practical it is to actually hold the Chinese government to account, because internally the government like takes control of everything because it's communist. So, and they're evidently persecuting those who are resisting them. And externally, what the UN does usually is sanction a country if they're going against, international values such as like human rights and stuff. But how could you do that to China, which is one of the world-leading economic powers? I feel like there's only so much that can be done.
Absolutely. So you actually raised a very valid point, and that the sister asked was that how practical is it to account the Chinese government, considering that they are one of 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council? Yes. Is that yeah? And therefore they have veto power, and is in essence a free card to do as they wish, as we've seen Britain, France, America, and Russia have done similarly as well. Sister, the point here is, on the Day of Judgment, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are accounted for our actions and our deeds, we can at least say in front of Allah that we did what we could. Yes, I signed that petition. I attended that demonstration. I wrote that letter to the ambassador. I attended that event and I asked that question. How fruitful and practical it would be is something which is al-ghaib to us and we will not know. But when we have those means, we have to utilize it. My second point is one which requires you all to think outside of the box. Outside of the box of the nation state. Outside the box of existing international norms, right? Because when I mentioned that the nation state is a very, very new phenomena of statehood, barely 100 years old for the vast majority of the world, and that there are certain bodies that exist to maintain this order and to concentrate power in a handful of countries, that we need to now start breaking those ideologies which, namely nationalism and asabiya. There are many hadith of the beloved Prophet where he speaks very critically and uses very harsh language towards this ideology of asabiya, whether it be tribalism or whether it is some kind of bond which is beyond or stronger than the bond of Islam. So as long as this is a predominant ideology, you will never see the kind of intervention that we would love to see as an ummah. Whenever something happens in Palestine or in Syria, you will see in many parts of the Muslim world and in the West that you will see many Muslims take to the streets. Why? Because their sentiments are sahih. They know the concept of ummah. I'm confident that all the Muslims in this room know it and I know it. That when you see something happening to your brothers, you feel it, and your sister, you feel it. When Iraq happened, Afghanistan happened, you feel it. You know what that is? That's because it's actually part of our aqidah. It's the way that it's the way we're made up as Muslims, right? But when you have artificial borders, ideologies and ways of thinking which are alien to our creed, preventing a brother or a Muslim state from intervening, then you have to ask serious questions. When our beloved Prophet ﷺ says that when you see a munkar, change it with your hands. If you cannot change it with your hands, speak out against it. And the lowest of iman is to hate it from within. Allah says in the Quran that He's raised us as the best nation from amongst mankind. Why? Because we enjoin good and forbid evil. And the hadith which I mentioned in the lecture, the best form of jihad is to have a word of truth to a tyrannical rule. So I took the M25 scenic route to respond to your questions. So just to recap, we have to do what we can within our means. Whether it's accepted and how beneficial it will be down the road is something outside of our sphere of control, but we have to do it. Secondly, we see the general apathy of the Muslim majority world, not just with regards to the Uyghur plight. This is quite a new thing now. The plight of the Uyghur is just something that's been discussed in the last year or two. But we've got the plight of the Palestinians, of the Kashmiris and other oppressed peoples, and you see general apathy or complicity of the respective governments. We need to break away from this thinking that borders and national identities prevent us or is stronger than the bond of brotherhood of Islam. That is the biggest solution, and we can all play a role in that, in basic dialogue, in discussing ideas and changing people's way of thinking. You know, the fruits and the results is with Allah. We just have to do what we can within our means. Take one more question.
Brother, just to go back to what you said, you can listen to a talk like this and feel a little bit hopeless. We can't deal with the Chinese authority and government. And then the brother here mentioned something about when our states do things, they do them by piecemeal. And so I was thinking about one of the things that we can do here is recognise the fact that communism or capitalism has really failed to unite people, give people a home where everybody's welcome. And I think it's just a bit of a notion that it's got this freedom of religions and freedom of speech. I think it's just a bit of a falsehood. And if you just look back in this room, there are people from Yemen in this room, or Pakistan or Bangladesh. These were countries that they politically colonized, but there was no equality. And then when they couldn't politically colonize us, they economically did that, which is why there's wars and famine in places where there's untold wealth. And now we're in a place where there's ideological colonialism, where you feel piecemeal by piecemeal, you're not allowed to raise your voice, you're not allowed to account. And I think that's where our hope lies.
Absolutely.
That's where our reward lies, that we can say things and feel courageous in that. And we have an ability to account those ideas and stop that piecemeal attack. So I don't know if anybody saw, but there was a little kid in Huddersfield that got bullied by people. Just those ideas, that the guy who was bullying him, he's a young guy. Somebody's given him those ideas. And it's those ideas that we can prevent, so that stops it at that level as well as this level.
That's a fantastic comment. I want to conclude this talk and that is that, look, engage, speak, discuss ideas, right? Never accept the existing norms as the default, because they're not. And just because I was critical of communism, I didn't want anyone to think that this guy is a cheerleader for capitalism or the secular liberal democracy, nothing like that. Each have their own respective problems. And I would humbly argue that the only reason where the nation state or liberal democracy as we understand it today was a successful project was in Europe and North America. Why? Because it was from the history of Christendom that these ideas were born out of. They were not born from the Orient or the East. These were ideas which were born out of the Reformation, and therefore it successfully worked in Europe and North America. And when it was superimposed in other parts of the world which were formerly colonized, you see the best that you see today. Jazakallah khairan, thank you for your patience. May Allah bless you all in this